It is time to talk Penn State football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please like, comment, and subscribe. That keeps the engine rolling and keeps us with up-to-date content for you as we approach 2018. We're only 3 weeks away. We got Tim Aiden on the line from Black Shoe Diaries to talk up the Penn State Nittany Lions. And, of course, this is a name brand that we got to keep up with, and certainly based on the recruiting efforts and the results over the last 2 seasons, a force to be reckoned with, we expect here in 2018. Tim, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Mark. Just avoiding the heat and humidity down here in the DMV area. So,
well, as you mentioned, with your running and your training, that's kind of difficult to do. You got to get out there.
Yep. Yeah. Regardless of what rain, shine, 100% humidity. Yeah, gotta get in the training.
So everybody's in camp as of late last week or early this past week. And for Penn State, of course, it's trying to erase a couple plays that meant a Big Ten championship and a college football playoff appearance. What do we have out of camp? Anything early? We certainly don't want to hear about injuries. Any camp updates in regards to anything that you've gotten out of camp?
Well, I think first and foremost, the biggest story out of camp was the return of Manny Bowen. He was, as you may know, he was originally dismissed from the team right before the Fiesta Bowl due to a violation of team rules, unspecified violation of team rules, and it wasn't his first time being suspended due to a violation of team rules. He had been suspended from the Rose Bowl the year before that, so it seemed at that point that Manny was good as gone. But there was a cryptic Instagram post from him back in June basically implying that he's back with the team practicing. And on the morning of the first practice, not the morning of the first practice, but the morning of media day, there were pictures posted on Penn State's official athletics page in the photo gallery, and there happened to be a photo of a familiar-looking figure wearing Manny Bowen's number 43, and that sparked speculation on the Lions 24/7 message board. And so the people at GoPSUSports.com took it down because they didn't want that to. I guess they wanted to let James Franklin officially announce it at his press conference, which he eventually did that day. But that's the biggest story, and it's a huge boost to what's a thin linebacking core, an inexperienced one. So him bringing that senior leadership to the linebacking core, and perhaps working his way back into being a starting middle linebacker, it could go a long way, especially towards the latter half of the season, having an experienced guy like him, while guys like Micah Parsons and Ellis Brooks, Jesse Lukita get their feet wet.
Manny Bowen, a guy that racked up 67 total tackles 2 years ago in a very productive season with 8.5 tackles for loss in the Rose Bowl campaign. And then last season in getting to the Fiesta Bowl, that game that he missed, as Tim alluded, 51 tackles, 3 tackles behind the line of scrimmage in an area in which, as you allude to, Tim, if there's a concern, if there's speculation of areas that can't be hit by injury for this team to compete for a Big Ten championship, it would be kind of down the middle on the defense. There are some very strong points. There are great players, or really good players, I should say, all across the board. But in terms of depth, there seem to be concerns, as you mentioned, inside at the linebacker spot and elsewhere on the defense.
Yeah, so linebacker, obviously, that's the biggest one. And so the other big concern was at defensive tackle, not defensive end. That's people, I think unanimously, people are pretty bullish about the pass rush. But in the middle on the line is where there's concern, not because of the starters. Robert Windsor and Kevin Givens are expected to do pretty well as starters, but it's just there's concern about lack of depth underneath them. However, I apparently Sean Spencer, the defensive line coach, has a different opinion. He's not I'm very concerned about the defensive tackle depth. And just want to give a shout out to my Black Shoe Diaries colleagues, Patrick Corber, who you've had on your show, and also Clay Sauertig. They were both there for media day last Saturday. They got some pretty good quotes from Spencer and Matt Limegrover, the offensive line coach, amongst others. So I have some interesting things to point out just from interviewing Spencer. He said he doesn't have a maximum number of people he'll play in his rotation on the line. It's just however many people he thinks are ready to play, he'll rotate those guys in. So if he's only comfortable with 8 people, he'll play those 8. If there's like 12 people, he'll gladly, shuffle like line changes in a hockey game or something. So that was interesting to read. And you'd also expect to see Yetur Gross-Matos. He played as a freshman last year sparingly. He could slide into defensive tackle and obvious passing situations, which is something that Ryan Buchholz was doing last year. He was a defensive end, but would slide into D tackle on like third down passing situations. And PJ Mustipher, who's a currently enrolled freshman on the team, 4-star defensive tackle. He's been drawing a lot of hype in camp from what I've read. So that's another. So reading those, I can see why Sean Spencer isn't as concerned about the D tackle as the punditry may be.
Talking Penn State football, we got Tim Aiden on the line. He joins us from time to time. Has done some great work, obviously, there on SB Nation with Black Shoe Diaries, but also for us in talking about Penn State football. It's an intriguing situation with the Nittany Lions coming very close in going all the way, especially last year. And then 2 years ago, of course, made the improbable run through the Big Ten after a rough start to get to the Rose Bowl and win the Big Ten championship. Looking at the offense, what I find interesting is obviously Saquon Barkley. We know the deal with him. He just ripped off like a 40-yard run, his first carry in the NFL. Not that it counted, but against the Cleveland Browns in a handful of carries last night for the New York Giants. The two backs coming in are much acclaimed and should do very well. But in terms of just kind of the offensive approach, without Joe Moorhead, without Deshaun Hamilton and Barkley and Mike Gesicki, a lot of big playmakers. This has been maybe the most fun offense to watch in the Big Ten over the last couple of years, and arguably the best offense in the Big Ten the last 2 years. And you still have the quarterback in play who's a gunslinger, game-changing kind of guy that makes dynamic plays, but maybe just not quite having that explosiveness. I don't know if there's a concern, especially without the creative mind of Joe Moorhead, that the big play capability may not be what it was.
So maybe I touched on this in the last time we talked, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But Ricky Ronnie, the current offensive coordinator who was promoted from within after Moorhead left, he was like Moorhead's apprentice for the last 2 years. So he studied under, learned the nuances of Joe Moorhead's system. And when push came to shove, when it was time for him to man the controls for the Fiesta Bowl, he did a solid job in his debut. Maybe there were some, obviously I don't think any two coaches are alike in terms of what plays they like to call necessarily, or maybe, and each coach has their own little nuances they like to throw in. So, and I noticed that from the Fiesta Bowl where, Penn State at one point seemed to try to shovel past Washington to death. I'm hoping there's a few less of those during this season, but apparently Ricky Ronnie enjoys that. And he might have some other things up his sleeve too that maybe Joe Moorhead wasn't a fan of or just didn't think of trying. I think the other thing I noticed too and I don't mean this to knock on Moorhead, but late in the game when Penn State was still only up by a touchdown and they were driving to try and kill clock or maybe score score a field goal or a touchdown that could effectively put the game away, he still allowed Trace to just sling the ball around the field. He didn't. I can remember back at the Rose Bowl the previous year when Penn State was trying to cling to their lead against USC. It seemed like they were trying to just feed the ball to Saquon Barkley, and he would just keep getting stuffed. Instead of allowing Trace to just try and air it out and be aggressive, it seemed like they turtled up a bit. But from what I noticed, it seemed Ronnie wasn't afraid to be aggressive late in the game. He wasn't playing to try and nurture a lead. He was just playing to try and steal the deal.
And also an understanding of game situation in regards to time left on the clock and field position and all those things come into play, because there is a point in the game in which football coaches you can look at the time and reasonably say, based on score and time and our defensive ability to stop them based on what's happened throughout the rest of the game, we're up 20 points. There's 6 minutes left in the game. We can take the air out of it. We don't have to take chances. We're up 3 scores. There's 6 minutes. We should be able to run out the clock and not throw another pass. But there's 12 or 14 minutes left in the game. You're up 2 scores. This is still a football game, very much a football game. So there's some game and clock management that obviously plays into that strategy as well, that in today's game, these offenses are so explosive and able to pick up big yardage and so efficient with the clock management that it's not what it was 30 or 40 years ago, and this has been the case for quite some time, that we've seen we see it every week in college football. We'll see 20-point leads erased in the fourth quarter on a fairly regular basis. So until you grind it down to about 5 or 6 minutes, unless you're up by 45 points, you got to stay, maybe not stupid aggressive, but you got to stay aggressive and run the offense. Now, maybe you do what the Atlanta Falcons didn't do in the Super Bowl 2 years ago. You can stay aggressive in terms of play calling, but you got to watch the play clock. And why not use up the play clock and kill as much time as possible? That's a whole other deal as well. So, yeah, just interesting. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the offense and how it may change coming up this season with obviously the main man in play, but the different coordinator, different playmakers on the outside, and of course, the best player in college football is gone. So we talked recruiting, Tim, and we're joined by Tim Aiden. He joins us from Black Shoe Diaries, has been on dozens of times here at Mark Rogers TV, doing a great job for us, talking up Penn State. So we talked before coming on about recruiting, and everybody's chasing Ohio State in the Big Ten. And that's what it's been. And Urban Meyer obviously builds his program on recruiting. And he's up the ante in the Big Ten. And then you bring James Franklin, who obviously had that mentality but limitations. So he was surrounded by that mentality in the SEC. He had to deal with limitations there at Vandy on a number of fronts. But he comes in, makes it, again, a national program in terms of recruiting. And it's at a place where the Ohio State roster, if we're making them the gold standard, and they are currently in the Big Ten, but we know how razor thin it is based on last season's game in particular. It just apparently is a depth issue at this point, that Ohio State doesn't necessarily have better players, but they just have more of them.
Yeah, I would agree on that. And I think you saw that depth, rear its ugly head for Penn State in last year's game in Columbus, when, especially on the lines, when Ryan Bates went down and the O-line suddenly had issues, blocking for Saquon Barkley or protecting Trace McSorley, or at least not letting Trace run for his life every play, which it seemed like he was starting to do late in the game because they just couldn't get that protection for him. And also in the D-line, when Ryan Buchholz went down, you're losing one of your best pass rushers and, run stoppers. So he also saw an inability to get to JT Barrett in the second half, and he just turned into a video game as far as, completing passes and just rallying the team back from, what seemed, I wouldn't say an insurmountable deficit, but what was obviously a very steep climb for them after being down 21-3 early. They end up winning by a point.
Yeah, 21-3, 28-10. It was always in that 18 range. So anyway, getting to my point was basically just in regards to recruiting. And I talk to you guys all the time, not just obviously Penn State, but bloggers, broadcasters, beat writers, and nobody's talking much recruiting across the nation, hardly at all. It's pretty quiet right now. And Penn State continues to make a dent with some big gets here just in the last 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, so they've had a total of actually 7 recruits since July 1st commit to the team, although one of them may be wavering towards Northwestern, which is something you don't hear very often. But just some of the names I won't touch on all the names, but some of the more important names. I think the most intriguing ones actually to me are guys that are completely out of Penn State's natural recruiting area. So there's a receiver, 4-star receiver, John Dunmore out of Hollywood, Florida, originally a Gators commit, but then the current running backs coach, Jaywan Sider, who had previously recruited him at UF when he was an assistant there, he obviously now on Franklin's squad, and he's been making some inroads into Florida for the Nittany Lions, and this is his first big grab out of that state for him. So hopefully the first of many more as far as stealing Florida recruits, which is something that it seems like the Ohio States of the conference tend to do. Obviously that's not gonna be the bulk of your recruiting, but if you can nab a few of those kids from SEC country or from Texas, to sprinkle around the rest of your roster, what you get from your natural territory, it definitely can make a difference. And Michael Johnson Jr., 4-star quarterback out of Eugene, Oregon, which may sound surprising considering the fact his dad is actually an assistant on the Oregon staff. But apparently, I guess Oregon's quarterback, they're already full at quarterback recruiting for this cycle, and I think also the offense are running under Mario Cristobal is going to be, it's not quite the style that suits Michael Johnson Jr. So he's more of a spread kind of guy. So he came to I believe it was the last bash. It was a big recruiting thing that Penn State puts on in July. They host a bunch of top recruits, have a little barbecue and whatnot. And so he obviously hit it off very well with the staff, and he committed last week, I believe, was August 1st. So those are two of the more intriguing recruits. They also beefed up on the offensive line, Salim Wormley and Anthony Wiggin, a couple 4-star linemen. Wiggin is interesting story. He plays for Lackawanna Community College, which is a place that Penn State's gotten some guys out of in recent years. And he's actually going to be playing with his current teammate at Lackawanna, Jaquan Brisker, because Brisker, a safety, committed to Penn State back in May. So that Lackawanna to State College pipeline Scranton to State College pipeline's looking pretty solid. And also another 4-star linebacker, Lance Dixon out of Michigan, committed. So in addition to him and Brandon Smith coming in, the future of linebacker U is looking pretty bright for Penn State.
We got Tim Aiden on the line. We're talking Penn State football. You can join Tim and the rest of the crew there at Black Shoe Diaries on the SB Nation site, talking Penn State, of course, with the Nittany Lions in camp and getting ready for a Big Ten title run. They're in what is arguably the best division in college football. I'm going to argue that it's not necessarily top to bottom the best, but where it counts in competing for a championship, it's the best. 1 through 4, it's the best. And it's loaded. So that brings us to what has been the biggest story in college football since the championship game, and that's Urban Meyer and the issue at Ohio State. So we don't need to address the issue because obviously you're not going to say anything different, I don't believe, than anybody else in regards to, we just want justice served. We just want the truth to be out there. We just want people brought to justice and the right things to be done there. But from a football standpoint, we alluded to it in talking about the recruiting, talking about last year's game, and obviously Penn State winning 2 years ago and outplaying Ohio State for 3+ quarters last year. The margin is razor thin. I think it's more of a depth issue than anything else. And you can throw a blanket on 3 or 4 teams in the Big Ten East, and certainly that starts with Ohio State and then Penn State. So it's not like Urban Meyer needs to be out of the way to clear the way for Penn State to go to Big Ten championship games and playoffs. They've proven that they can stand toe-to-toe with Ohio State and get it done. Certainly not going to hurt the cause if Urban Meyer's out of the way, based on him having the 3rd best winning percentage in the history of the game and winning 91% of his games there in Columbus. So again, putting the issue aside and just looking at the football ramifications, what was the Penn State reaction to the Urban Meyer news?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think the first thing, of course, is they weren't thinking about the football part. Obviously, they all want the best for Courtney Smith and her family. But now putting that part aside, from a football standpoint, it's something that, obviously Penn State fan base is keeping an eye on. Although I think if you ask most fans, we don't really expect much of a drop off, if any, from Ohio State, regardless what happens to Urban Meyer. So let's say if Meyer is gone, they do end up firing him. So Ryan Day seems like a very capable rising star in the coaching ranks. He almost accepted the offensive coordinator position for the Tennessee Titans with Mike Vrabel over there. But I guess I don't know. I don't know if Urban convinced him to stay or they threw more money at him or whatnot. But he seems like a rising star in the coaching ranks. So who knows if Meyer's fired and if Ryan Day leads them to another Big Ten championship or gets them to the playoffs, maybe they dump the interim tag from him and keep him on as the permanent head coach. Or I also keep reading, Matt Campbell's name. It pops up all the time as potential successor to Urban. Even before all this happened, his name was brought up as maybe a future Ohio State head coach someday. So he'd be another name to keep an eye on. I think either of those guys could probably keep the train on the tracks as far as recruiting and winning is concerned. Now that being said, I mean, Urban Meyer, he's a lock for the Hall of Fame. He's just, I don't know how you can clear the bar that he's set at Ohio State. You can maybe touch the bar, but I don't know how you're gonna clear what he's done. It's unless you win back-to-back or 3 straight national titles at Ohio State. I mean, I don't know how you're gonna top what Urban Meyer's done. So there could be the slightest bit of a drop off. I mean, pretty negligible because they'll still have enough talent to run roughshod for most of the conference. But when it comes to teams like Penn State and Michigan State, teams that are trying to knock Ohio State off their perch as the yearly favorites in the Big Ten East, the door may become slightly more ajar for those teams.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. Throughout the history of college football, Penn State and Ohio State both are at the top of the list in regards to blue bloods. There's a handful of them, close to 10. Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, Notre Dame, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, USC. We expect them to win. More recently in history, Miami and Florida State, although they've had their issues at times. But so we expect, you just hire a capable coach. You should be able to have your pick of the litter, and you've got the resources and the money at Ohio State, and Ohio State always wins. So that's one thought. But on the other hand, Florida post Steve Spurrier, and based on what he was able to establish at Florida, they seemed like, okay, well, this is a new power in college football that's as good as any. And Steve Spurrier won a national title, and he's always competing for the SEC. And so Florida's going to be Florida, and they're going to win as much as anyone. Well, he left, and between he and Urban Meyer, it was a much different program. Sure, they had talent. They had players in the NFL all over the field. But, I made a mention to somebody the other day when we were talking about Urban Meyer's legacy, and disregarding, again, the off the field issues and just looking at the sheer dominance of his teams, is that Florida lost 5 games 3 consecutive seasons before he got there. And then they win 2 national titles in 3 years. And then he leaves and they start losing 5 games again. And Ohio State, they were really good under Jim Tressel, so that's not a direct correlation, because you could say Tressel did what he did in his own right, which was basically go to a BCS bowl game almost every year that he was there. So he was running a string of Big Ten titles as well. It's almost like Nick Saban at Alabama. We assume, okay, Nick Saban leaves, they get the next guy, and it's Alabama. They keep going. Well, Alabama was playing like 500 football before Nick Saban showed up for a period of time. So it's not necessarily automatic. And look what's happened to Texas. They've had trouble getting back on track. So I wouldn't completely, and I know you're not completely discounting the absence of Urban Meyer and what the impact could be, but there's just a couple guys that seem to walk around that go to whatever program, and suddenly, it's Utah going 13-0, and it's Florida winning 2 national titles, and it's losing 8 games in 7 years, and it's automatic winning, and there's only a couple of those guys around.
Precise. Yeah, I mean, you do make a point there. Although I guess I would counter argue though, that I think SEC overall is probably just a tougher conference over between the two divisions is probably tougher overall compared to the Big Ten right now, especially the West part of the Big Ten. It's Wisconsin and then everybody else right now. I mean, it's obviously Scott Frost in Nebraska. Maybe PJ Fleck gets Minnesota to be a pesky bunch as well. And of course, maybe Iowa tends to be good really good every now and then, as opposed to just, being a 8-win team. But it's just, and also I think the other factor is in the state of Ohio, it's Ohio State. There's no one that even comes close to touching Ohio State. Whereas Florida, not only are you dealing with the other teams in the SEC, the other blue bloods in the SEC, but you've also got Florida State, Miami. You've got they got these up and coming schools like UCF, USF. Nipping at some decent recruits. So, their backyard is a lot tougher than Ohio State's is. So that's why I think I'm less likely to agree with what happened with Florida post Urban Meyer, or what was happening at Bama pre Saban is what's necessarily going to happen at Ohio State post Meyer.
Or we throw USC into the mix, where you would expect USC should always win. And yeah, they're not going to be bad. They're for USC not to go 8-4, like I think we talked about before we started to record. There are certain programs with so much talent typically, and there's not many, but you or I could stand on the sideline and go 9-3. But besides that, obviously, since Pete Carroll left, that was a dominant program for 7 or 8 years, and he left, and they've had their issues, and they've been uneven, and they've been really good one year and 8-4 good the next year, and not dominant. And now we see Pete Carroll goes to the Seattle Seahawks, and we see how good they've been. So yeah, there's just a few guys out there that are able to pull that off. But again, Jim Tressel had it pretty much winning at the same level as Urban Meyer. If you really take it into consideration, top to bottom, he was winning close to 90% of his games and Big Ten titles every year through the back half of his stay there at Ohio State. So it'll be interesting regardless of what happens. And as we talked about before we started the live stream as well, even if Urban Meyer stays, that's a recruiting target on his back in terms of rival coaches saying, do you really want your child to play for that guy? And so we may not see the top 2 and 3 classes in the country. It may drop off to a top 10 to 15 level.
I mean, yeah, it is possible too.
Which is still really good, but
sure, but it's not. But I mean, Ohio State's been bringing in like top 10 classes at least every single year. Probably more like top 5. I mean, I don't have the things up in front of me, but
Yeah, the last few have been like 2 and 3.
yeah, so that sounds about right.
Yeah, they've been really high, and they're in position to do something similar. And as you mentioned with Penn State, the numbers, the rankings, of course, don't mean a whole lot right this second. But yeah, Penn State's drawing a great class. All right, yeah, just wanted to get your take on that. Anything we've missed on the Penn State front? Would love to have you back sometime before the opener.
Let's see. I was reading an article on Penn Live. They interviewed Terry Smith, the cornerbacks coach, and he sounds fairly bullish about the secondary. He thinks there could be a 10 to 12 player rotation there. And I know the secondaries we mentioned is they lost all their starters from last year, but John Reed is back. He missed all of last season with a knee injury, but he's back, and he may be better than ever at this point. But he had a pretty solid 2016 season. For those who may not remember, he was probably had a recruit as well. And Amani Oruwariye, he wasn't a starter technically last year, but he was all Big Ten. He had several interceptions last season. And also that safety, they'll have Nick Scott solidified one starting spot, and then Garrett Taylor, Lamont Wade, Aaron Monroe are all fighting for that second starting spot. And even the ones who don't win the starting job will probably feature heavily in the rotation. Tariq Castro Fields and Zach McPherson also at corner are names to keep an eye on. So and then a secondary could be better than some people might think.
Tim, something there you mentioned reminds me of a note that I saw online regarding Joe Moorhead going to Mississippi State, and a few comments that were made by former Penn State players that give Mississippi State fans a lot of hope that they hired the right guy. Marcus Allen had made a comment in particular. This is the one specific comment I remember, that basically the defense dominated the offense in practice, and Joe Moorhead shows up and basically said, hey, enjoy it while it's here. We're going to get this fixed, and we're going to be kicking your tails on the other side during practice. And Marcus Allen basically said, yeah, within the next, several weeks to couple months, we see a big turn, and, they're making plays on us in practice. And just a number of guys, Mike Gesicki made a comment. Somebody else made a comment in regards to just, this guy's going to do wonders at Mississippi State. He's a genius on offense.
Yeah, I think I'd echo their sentiments, and they know better than you or I would, or any other fan would. But it was. I think it was home run hire from Mississippi State. He'll breathe. Not to say that. I mean, Mullen's offense was doing fine, but I think he might even be able to get even more out of this team than Mullen was. I guess what remains to be seen what's going to happen on the defensive side of the ball. But offensively, I think they're gonna, not only they're not going to skip it, they might be even more explosive under him. I think, and I guess you mentioned how Penn Staters were saying glowing things about him, like after went to Mississippi State. There's been I noticed a picture somewhere. Franklin sent a care package to Joe Moorhead recently. Some Penn State-like items, and also just wishing him best of luck. I think it had some popcorn in there, so I think his favorite snack, I guess. So there's definitely, and then amongst the fan base too, like, there's a lot of congratulatory remarks and comments I'm seeing, like, well, you're my second favorite team now, and whatnot. So I think I may not go on my way to watch it, but if I happen to see him on TV, I would definitely drop the remote and watch. And I'm certainly going to pay attention to how he does, because, in the long-term scheme of things, it would be great for the James Franklin and Penn State coaching tree if Moorhead absolutely kills it at Mississippi State. Because, I hope it's not anytime soon, but there will be a day when James Franklin's no longer the head coach at Penn State, and you have to figure Joe Moorhead will probably be one of the first people that the AD tries to call and make an offer to.
All right, some strong Penn State football discussion with Tim Aiden. You can join him on Black Shoe Diaries with the rest of the staff on SB Nation, talking about Penn State football. Of course, it's I believe Appalachian State out of the gate, and the what has become maybe an annual rivalry once again with Pitt headlines the out of conference slate for a team that's expected to vie for a place in the top 10 and more importantly, a place in the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis as they did 2 years ago. All right, Tim, we appreciate the time and we will see you soon.
Yeah, as always, thanks for having me on.
Good stuff. I just want to remind everyone that as Tim jumps off here, Tim, you can do whatever you want. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping here, but let everyone know that, again, in the description section of all the videos, you find Amazon links, and you can help us out by using those to do your Amazon shopping. So you don't have to buy what's on the links. Just use that to enter the site and help us out here at Mark Rogers TV. Also, we have a mailing list. So if you send me your email to markrogerstv@gmail, markrogerstv@gmail, we are building out a mailing list that just started a few days ago, and we're into double digits. And starting week 1 of the college football season, we'll provide my perspective, my take on college football and whatever's going on right then. And more so than that, a collection of interesting facts, data that you won't find in any one place anywhere else, and then also a channel update in regards to what content we're providing, what upgrades we're doing to provide better content and a better production look and everything else for you here at Mark Rogers TV. So that starts week 1. Again, send your email address to markrogerstv@gmail. All right, we got our schedule rankings. Penn State was back there in the 40s somewhere. I don't remember exactly where I had them ranked, but more schedule rankings. We go into the top 20. Now we just did Pitt at number 21. They've got to deal with Penn State and Notre Dame and Central Florida outside of the conference. And they're right at the cusp of the top 20 schedules in the nation. Then we're going to do our previews and predictions the last 2 weeks before the 2018 opener. So we appreciate everybody jumping on board. If you missed any of the other videos, we did Georgia Tech. And we also did LSU today. We've got Alabama coming up tomorrow and a number of other interesting comments. Of course, Tim and I discussed Urban Meyer, and we did 3 to 4 full hours of Urban Meyer coverage with a number of bloggers and broadcasters and analysis from myself during that time. So go back and check that out if you want to get the perspective from guys that from 247 Sports and elsewhere that cover the Buckeyes on a daily basis. We will see you guys soon and enjoy the weekend. And of course, let's get set for college football 2018.